People with an insecure attachment style tend to have fairly predictable relationship histories. If you look back at this person's relationship history, it often kind of follows a pretty typical pattern for that attachment style. First, let's start out with fearful avoidance. Fearful avoidance will tend to have their longest relationships, even marriages, with people that are emotionally unavailable. Typically, it's with either a narcissist or a dismissive avoidant. This is because of the anxious side of the fearful avoidant, because fearful avoidants have both a dismissive avoidant and anxious preoccupied attachment. The emotionally unavailable person, whether they are a narcissist or a dismissive avoidant, is going to trigger the anxious side of the fearful avoidant. And they will spend most of this relationship in their anxious side, trying to earn the love from this person, trying to manage the other person's reactions to keep them from leaving, and holding no boundaries in the relationship whatsoever. Boundaries being limits of what they want, don't need, will tolerate, not tolerate. They're non-existent because those types of partners will run away if boundaries are set. Those relationships will come to a quick end. Fearful avoidance in childhood often experience chaos, volatility, hot and cold parents, and sometimes even physical, emotional abuse or trauma. There's a comfort in familiarity, and this is why fearful avoidants will often find themselves in a relationship with a narcissist, because it's familiar, it reminds them of their childhood, whether they realize it or not, and their anxious side is in full force. Now, their shortest relationships will be with people that are emotionally available, because emotionally available partners, especially ones that lean more anxious, are going to trigger the fearful avoidant side. They will shut down eventually and push this person away, looking for an excuse to justify their fears, fault finding in the relationship, because they have this preconceived notion that they're going to be betrayed, plus their longer term relationships with dismissive avoidance as well as narcissists confirm the betrayal, so they project this onto the partner that actually is emotionally available, and they will cut that relationship short. So typically that's how it goes with a fearful avoidant. Long-term relationships with dismissive avoidance or very toxic narcissistic partners, and shorter-term relationships with emotionally available partners. Now, let's get into dismissive avoidance. Dismissive avoidants often have their longer-term relationships with other dismissive avoidants. This is because that relationship will feel safe. It feels safe because there's no threat of emotional intimacy. There is no threat of emotional vulnerability. Both partners are equally walled off and emotionally unavailable. They tend to emotionally neglect each other. They can often be in relationships where they behave just like roommates. It's unfulfilling, but they can stay in this relationship for a long time because their fears are not triggered by somebody who is walled off, distant, and emotionally unavailable. Now, typically one of the two dismissive avoidants will end the relationship at some point because it's unfulfilling. Deep down, they do long for emotional intimacy, closeness, and love. The problem is when they find it, it scares them. So their longer term relationships will be dismissive avoidant, but their shorter term relationships are often with emotionally available partners. And especially when there's an anxious emotionally available partner, they will end that one quickly. But even a more secure emotionally available partner will trigger the dismissive avoidance fears, because emotional intimacy is going to build in that relationship because that person's not walled off. That person's willing to be vulnerable and available for the dismissive avoidant. And that will trigger their fears because they learned from childhood that emotional closeness is not safe. It leads to rejection and abandonment. That's because they were consistently emotionally neglected by their parents or caretakers. So they learned if you rely on anybody else for your emotional needs, they're going to disappoint you, hurt you, reject you, abandon you. So when intimacy starts to grow in a relationship with an emotionally available partner, it triggers the fears of a dismissive avoidant. They feel emotionally unsafe and they seek to end those relationships. So they'll have their long-term relationships with another dismissive avoidant typically, and their shorter-term relationships with somebody who is emotionally available. Okay, let's get into anxious attachment. All right, anxiously attached people tend to have all of their relationships with emotionally unavailable people, whether it's a narcissist or an avoidant, fearful or dismissive. This goes back to the anxious attacher's childhood. They learned that it was their responsibility to manage everybody else's feelings, that they had to self-sacrifice their own wants and needs to make everybody else happy, that they had to earn love from people. And this typically comes from an environment where they had to earn the love from a parent or parents, caretakers, that it wasn't just consistently given hot and cold messages. And they frequently at least had one parent that was emotionally unavailable. So now, as an adult, they're trying to seek that love from that emotionally unavailable parent. They're trying to rectify their childhood. Anxious attachers also struggle with boundaries. In many cases, their boundaries are just non-existent. So they allow relationships with emotionally unavailable people to prolong because they're not holding their limits. They're not saying no when they're being treated in a way that isn't healthy, isn't fair, and they make themselves especially vulnerable to people like narcissists as well as avoidance, because the anxious attacher will try to earn the love. When they're being mistreated, they personalize it. They think it must be something that they did wrong to cause this person to behave this way. So they try harder and they try harder and they try harder, because the anxiously attached person desperately wants love. They want connection. They want emotional intimacy, and they feel like it's their job to earn it. And the way that they think they earn it is by catering to the needs of the other person, self-sacrificing, holding no boundaries, and hoping that their efforts are enough to get this person to love them. Now, the anxiously attached person obviously can learn that holding boundaries is actually the best thing they can do, because it will shorten those unhealthy relationships and help them find an emotionally available person. But until they do, they tend to have the majority, if not all, of their relationships with emotionally unavailable people. So as you can see, insecure attachment, they tend to follow predictable patterns with their relationship history. Obviously, not everybody is the same, but due to human nature, this is typically how it goes with each style.